The forest was eerily quiet that morning, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Laura's eyes scanned the trees, trained for signs of movement, for danger, for lives in peril. Then she heard it, a sound so small yet so powerful, it cut through the fog of her routine, the cry of a pup in distress. Pushing through the thicket, she saw him, a trembling German shepherd, barely more than a shadow in the dim light. And there, barely visible, was the mother dog, beaten down by injury and circumstance. The pup barked softly, nuzzling her with determination, refusing to leave. He was small, but his courage filled the clearing. Laura's hands shook as she grabbed her radio, calling for urgent assistance. But even as she spoke to dispatch, she couldn't tear her eyes away from that pup. He was more than a creature in need. He was a guardian, a messenger of hope. And in that moment, Laura understood. Some rescues are not about saving. They are about trust, connection, and the quiet courage that changes lives. What she didn't know yet was that this small act of bravery, the pup's refusal to give up, would lead her to discover the kind of love and loyalty she had never imagined. The first light slid between the pines like a quiet promise, thin and amber, drawing a soft sheen across the needles beaded with dew. Laura Hayes stepped from the gravel turnout onto the narrow trail she knew by heart, her boots finding the familiar music of stone and dirt. The forest met her with its clean breath, sap and damp bark, the cool mineral scent of night not yet chased away. She clipped her radio to her shoulder, thumb checked the mic out of habit, then let her hand fall to the badge at her chest. The metal was cool, reassuring. Some mornings, even here, she needed that. This hour had always been hers. Before traffic woke, before complaints stacked in her inbox, before the faces in trouble asked to be saved, dawn made everything quiet enough to hear the small things, the hush of wind in the crowns, the leap of a squirrel from one trunk to another, the slow exhale she'd been holding since yesterday. She walked, and the forest kept her company, and for those first minutes, she pretended the world required nothing more of her than presence. The trail unfurled like ribbon. In places, it narrowed into a crease between ferns. In others, it widened, giving her a view down the slope where fog pooled, milky and moving. She knew where roots reached like knuckles across the path, where a downed cedar forced a step, where the old logging road veered off and died in brambles. She'd come to know her own footfalls, too, the way her weight shifted to avoid a slick stone, the way she set her heel first when she needed to listen harder. The radio crackled once and went quiet. "Copy," she said reflexively, though no one had called. It was mostly for herself, a small anchor in the hush. Her mind traveled in loops the way it did on mornings like this. Sleep had been thin, half dreams of a call that turned bad and then became every bad call at once. A house where the strangest silence lived. A car pulled to the shoulder with someone staring straight through her. A dog shaking under a kitchen table while a couple tried not to fight. She could still feel the weight of those stories riding with her. She had learned to make enough room for them without letting them get all the way in. It was a trick like breathing. Inhale, note, exhale, release. But today, an unease threaded through even the familiar, not the loud kind that sends blood surging. The other kind, thin, insistent, like a hair caught between pages you can't quite find. She paused at a bend where sunlight fractured through the needles and broke into flecks on the earth, and listened. There was nothing to justify it. The birds had begun their modest choir. Something rustled in the understory and fled. The world looked ordinary, which was sometimes how trouble dressed. "Get a grip," she said softly, a smile she didn't quite feel. She adjusted the strap of her vest and kept walking. Her cabin wasn't far from here, tucked among hemlocks off a spur road where the old maps still showed a ranger station that hadn't stood for 20 years. She thought of the sink full of dishes she hadn't dealt with, a solitary coffee cup, her father's mug from a station he'd retired from and then refused to leave behind. The chip in the rim lined up perfectly with her thumb when she drank. Little things that made a home feel less borrowed. The sun moved higher, barely. Rays came angled and thin. She glanced at her watch, not because time mattered here, but because it was a way of checking whether the world still made sense. Her fingers brushed the bezel, then drifted back to the radio. "Hayes, 102, East Ridge, all quiet." She kept her voice light. It was gratifying how often the forest obliged. A pair of deer flickered through the trees and vanished. She followed their path with her eyes, saw the brief flash of a tail, the hush of bodies that knew how to be invisible. The herd found water down in the draw at this hour. She sometimes trailed them as far as the creek, then turned back before the road. Today, the draw wore a veil of blue-white fog that made distance seem like a suggestion. Something tugged at her then, not a sound so much as the absence of one. The birds fell out of their chatter all at once, or else her ears flattened the world to listen. It was small, whatever it was, and it lived just at the edge of where certainty failed. She stilled, breath held away from the air, and let her senses widen. The wind moved in the canopies. A branch somewhere gave up under its own rot and dropped. In the space after, she felt that thread again. Tension collecting, then dissolving, then collecting once more like a tide that forgot its job. "Okay," she whispered. She pressed deeper along the trail. The crunch underfoot took on a steadier cadence, hands settling into the rhythm of her stride. She scanned the forest in the steady way she'd learned. Near ground first, tracks, disturbances, then midline for movement, then high for shape and color that didn't belong. The pines belonged. Sun in the needles belonged. An overturned patch of leaf litter did not. She crouched beside it, fingertips hovering. The earth here had been scuffed recently, not by boots. Claws had raked. It looked like a scramble, a pause, a decision. Small. Maybe raccoon. Maybe something else. She got up slowly and checked the wind direction out of habit. From the north. If scent mattered here, she wanted to be where she could receive it. Her father used to say that. If scent matters, be where you can receive. He'd meant it about people. Want to know who they are? Stand where their wind reaches you. Laura stood and waited. The forest waited back, patient as an old dog. A dragonfly stitched a line of light before her. The fog thinned and drew itself into ribbons that drifted between trunks. She could see farther into the understory now. The ferns held still, then trembled, then became still again. Her unease didn't rise exactly. It settled into her like a stone, finding its pocket. The badge at her chest picked up the first slant of sun and warmed beneath her fingers. It surprised her, that small heat. She smiled at herself because she knew what it meant, that she'd been holding her breath again. She pulled air in slow, felt it open her lungs, let it out in a lengthened stream, and watched it ghost in the chill. A jay scolded once and flew off. Somewhere uphill, a woodpecker found its work. On another morning she might have named the calls without thinking, but this morning she only counted them, a way of proving to herself that the world's pieces still fit. She took another step, and her boot rolled a small stone that skittered down the slope and went quiet. That small clatter carried farther than it should have. She winced, and the old instinct rose, the one that makes you wish to be softer than your body can manage. She steadied, then reached for the radio and caught herself. No call. No reason. Not yet. You could spook what needed not be spooked. She thought of the last time she'd had this feeling and laughed once, soundless. A cat, it had been. A stray that had hidden under a porch and made a noise like a child trying not to cry. She'd spent an hour with a can of tuna and a patience she didn't know she still had. The cat had come out finally, small and furious and starved for touch. It had slept that night on her jacket like it had paid for the privilege. The memory softened her. She let it. There was no use walking around armored when the world asked for gentleness. Another bend in the trail, and the light thinned again. She stepped into a corridor of shadows, and the temperature fell enough to find her skin. Her forearm prickled. The hair along it lifted. She stilled again, not because fear told her to, but because something else did. Something older and more precise. The sound came then, a brush of leaves, so faint it could have been wind. But the wind wasn't moving there. It lived low, near the ground, no heavier than a whispering hand. If you didn't want to hear it, you wouldn't have. She did. Laura's eyes moved before her head did, scanning the seam between fern and earth, where small lives pass. Nothing. Then, a darker shape pressed into shadow, still as a thought you're afraid to think. She softened her posture, shoulders lowering, knees unhinging. Her hand settled lightly on the radio mic, not to use it, but to remind her that help existed in the world if she needed it. The other hand came palm down in a gesture that meant calm, even if the only one to read it was herself. She let her breath ease out and didn't replace it. A trick she'd learned with skittish things. Take up less space, and the world sometimes comes to you. "Hey," she said, hardly louder than the leaf sound. The word went about 10 feet and fell. Silence answered first. Then, from that pocket of shadow, the shape separated from the earth and stood. Small. Too small to carry menace. A pair of ears, too big for the head that wore them, lifted and wavered. Eyes, dark, round, already full of stories, fixed on her, and did not blink. Laura didn't move. She could feel her own heartbeat in her mouth, not because she was afraid, but because she recognized the moment, the narrow space where trust first decides whether to live or die. She let the forest close around them like a prayer said under your breath, and in that hush did the simplest thing she knew how to do. She bent her knees and lowered herself toward the earth. Laura paused mid-stride, the rhythm of her boots silenced by something more subtle than noise. It was the kind of awareness that rose unbidden, a shift in the air, a ripple in the understory. She let her weight sink gently into the earth, boots cushioned by the damp moss, and tilted her head, listening. For a heartbeat there was only the hush of wind threading through pine boughs and the steady thrum of her own pulse. Then it came again, a faint rustle, low to the ground, quick and uncertain, as if something small wrestled with the choice to step forward or remain unseen. Her hand drifted instinctively toward the radio at her shoulder, but she stopped herself. This wasn't danger. It didn't carry the sharp note of threat. It was quieter than that, fragile in a way that made her chest ache before she even knew why. Slowly, Laura lowered herself into a crouch, her knees bending until the damp earth pressed through the fabric of her uniform. The shadows beneath a tangle of ferns parted, and there he was. A German shepherd puppy, no bigger than the loaf of bread she had left untouched on her kitchen counter that morning, stepped hesitantly into the thin ribbon of light. His oversized ears quivered, one standing straight as a flagpole, the other cocked sideways in clumsy defiance. His coat, a mix of sable and black, carried clumps of dirt, as though he had been burrowing or hiding. But it was his eyes, dark pools wide with fear and something even deeper, that stopped Laura's breath in her throat. The puppy froze, paws rooted to the earth. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, each breath trembling. His tail, thin and uncertain, gave the smallest twitch, caught between retreat and the desperate need to connect. Laura felt the world narrow to just that space between them. The unbroken gaze of a creature deciding whether to trust. She softened her posture further, lowering one hand palm up to the soil. She didn't speak at first. Silence, she knew, often said more than words. The forest seemed to recognize the sanctity of the moment, its chatter subsiding until only the faint tick of a woodpecker far away remained. When she finally spoke, her voice came out softer than she expected. "Hey there, little one." The words fell into the hush like a stone into a still pond, rippling outward with care. The pup flinched at the sound, his ears flattening for a beat, then rising again, cautious but listening. His nose twitched, pulling in her scent. Soap, leather, pine. He glanced at her hand, then back to her face, as if weighing her intentions. Laura felt the weight of his uncertainty and chose stillness. She let the cool air fill her lungs, willing her body to radiate calm. Minutes seemed to stretch, their silence punctuated only by the faint shift of leaves when the breeze passed. The pup's paw lifted an inch, toes splayed, claws scratching lightly against gravel. He held it there mid-air, trembling, then lowered it forward. One step. Another. His whole frame was taut, ready to bolt, yet something kept him rooted to her gravity. Laura's heart tightened. She had seen children look like that, eyes pleading for safety while their bodies stood ready to flee. The resemblance pierced her, a reminder that vulnerability carried the same shape, whether human or animal. She whispered again, this time not with words of command, but invitation. "It's all right. Take your time." The puppy's ears twitched. His small body trembled once more, then steadied. He took a final halting step, now close enough that Laura could see the flecks of lighter fur around his muzzle, the dirt streaks across his tiny legs. His nose lowered, quivering as it hovered near her fingertips. She didn't move, didn't dare close the last inches herself. She waited, letting him decide whether the world could hold something gentle. For the briefest moment, the pup leaned forward, his damp nose brushing the air above her palm. Then as quickly, he froze again, the battle inside him unresolved. His eyes met hers, deep, pleading, a silent question, asked by a soul too young to form it. Laura swallowed the knot in her throat. She wanted to scoop him up, to erase the fear etched into every fiber of his trembling body. But she held herself back. Trust, she knew, could not be seized. It had to be offered. So she lowered her gaze, softening the intensity of her stare, and shifted her hand slightly, letting her fingers brush the soil. The message was clear. You are safe to choose. The pup gave a small whimper, a sound raw and delicate, like something breaking open. His ears pressed back for an instant, then rose again. He shuffled forward until his tiny paws left prints in the damp earth, barely an inch from her hand. He didn't close the gap, not fully, but the closeness itself felt like a vow. He was not lost, not drifting. He was reaching. Laura exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The forest around them seemed to breathe with her, the branches swaying lightly as though in agreement. For the first time that morning, the unease in her chest eased. Not vanished, but transformed into something else, an awareness that this meeting was not chance. The puppy's body trembled once more, but this time the tremor carried less fear than anticipation. He glanced back toward the deeper woods, then back at her, as if to say, the choice before them wasn't just about trust. It was about direction. Laura's pulse quickened. Something in his posture told her the story wasn't ending here. It was the beginning. She whispered again, barely audible, letting the words float between them. "Show me." The pup turned, his small body quivering but determined, and took a step into the undergrowth. Then he paused, looked back, and locked eyes with her. In that gaze, Laura felt it, the crossing of an invisible line. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Laura stayed crouched, her palm still open above the earth, the weight of patience steadying her breathing. The puppy, small, trembling, but anchored by some invisible thread, stood close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating off his tiny frame. His nose twitched once, twice, then lifted from her hand. In his eyes, Laura saw the storm of decisions churning. The instinct to run, the yearning to stay, the impossible courage it took for a creature so fragile to resist the louder voice of fear. She didn't rush him. She knew this moment was not about her. This was his choice. Then something shifted. His paws, still muddy from whatever ground he had crossed alone, pressed more firmly into the soil. He inhaled, a sharp, trembling breath that made his little ribs expand, and stepped back, not away, but toward the shadows of the deeper forest. Laura's brow furrowed. Her body leaned forward unconsciously, as if to stop him. But then she noticed the way he moved. Not like a creature retreating, not like a pup surrendering to panic. His steps carried a strange, deliberate rhythm, hesitant, but with an odd certainty, like he was following a path written in memory. He turned once, his oversized ears flicking toward her, his gaze locking with hers. And in that flicker of connection, Laura understood. This wasn't him leaving. This was an invitation. Her throat tightened. The thought came unbidden. He's asking me to follow. Laura rose slowly from her crouch, brushing soil from her knee, never breaking his gaze. The forest around them seemed to draw closer, branches folding in like watchful eyes. Every instinct of her training whispered caution. Don't abandon the trail. Don't step blind into uncertainty. But another instinct, quieter yet stronger, murmured something different. Trust him. Ash's tail gave the faintest twitch, as if relieved she had understood. He turned again, slipping into the low brush, his small body vanishing for a second in the green. Laura's pulse hammered in her ears. She adjusted the strap across her vest, steadied her breath, and stepped off the path. It was only a few feet at first, just soft moss replacing gravel, branches tugging at her sleeves, but the sensation was immediate, as if she had crossed an invisible threshold, leaving behind the safety of routine patrol for something raw and unpredictable. Ash's tiny frame reappeared a few yards ahead, paws pressing quietly over the forest floor. He moved in fits and starts, darting forward a few steps, then freezing to glance back, checking for her. His eyes seemed almost to plead, "Don't stop now." Laura followed carefully, her boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. She listened to the world around her, but the normal markers of the forest, the rustle of birds, the chirr of insects, seemed muted, almost holding their breath. All she could hear was the soft scrape of Ash's claws against soil and the heavy beat of her own heart. At one point, her boot caught on a tangle of roots, and she stumbled forward, catching herself with a hand against a cedar trunk. The puppy froze instantly, ears pricked high, body tense as a coiled spring. Laura steadied herself, exhaled, then offered him the same calm tone she'd used before. "Easy, little one. I'm still here." His ears twitched. After a heartbeat's hesitation, he turned and padded forward again, his tiny shoulders stiff but determined. Every step deeper tightened something inside her chest. She thought of the hundreds of patrols she'd walked, each predictable, each marked by routine. This, following a trembling pup into the unknown, felt nothing like that. It felt like stepping into a story she hadn't agreed to, but somehow belonged in. The light shifted as they pressed farther in. The sun's pale gold was filtered here, scattered into fractured beams that painted the moss in luminous patches. Shadows pooled thick at the base of trees, and every now and then, Laura thought she saw shapes flicker, branches swaying, leaves unsettled. But it was always Ash who reclaimed her focus. He moved like a compass needle, quivering, uncertain, but always pointing true. She found herself speaking softly as they went, not to guide him, but to reassure herself that the silence hadn't swallowed her whole. "Where are you taking me, Ash?" The name slipped out unbidden, and though she had never given it to him, it felt right. He flicked an ear at the sound, as if acknowledging it. The trail, or what could no longer be called a trail, wove them through dense undergrowth. Brambles snagged at Laura's pants. Branches brushed her shoulders. But the puppy darted through as if he had traveled this path before, each step carved by desperation and memory. Laura's pulse quickened again. She knew now, with a certainty that stole her breath, that this wasn't wandering. He wasn't simply trying to escape. He was leading her somewhere. And though part of her longed to call in, to demand rationality from her own choices, another part, older, more instinctive, kept her moving. She thought of the look in his eyes when he first stepped from the ferns, wide, desperate, but burning with something more than fear. It was hope, fragile, trembling hope. For a moment, her chest ached with the weight of it. She remembered faces she'd seen in her work, children clutching stuffed animals in doorways, victims clutching her hand in the back of an ambulance. Always the same plea: "Don't leave me alone in this." And here it was again, embodied in a trembling German shepherd pup who had chosen, against every instinct of survival, to trust her enough to lead. She let that thought steady her. When the puppy paused ahead, his body silhouetted in a rare beam of sunlight, Laura stopped too. They stared at each other across the short distance, the forest a cathedral of silence around them. Then Ash pivoted on his small paws and stepped deeper into shadow. Laura followed without hesitation, and in that moment, her boots sinking into soil no officer had reason to tread, her badge gleaming faintly in the fractured light. Laura felt it, the unmistakable crossing of a threshold. This was no longer routine patrol. This was a journey. Guided not by orders nor reason, but by the fragile determination of a trembling life too small to carry such a burden, yet refusing to set it down. She pressed forward, heart thudding. Whatever lay ahead, she would not let him walk it alone. The undergrowth thickened the farther they went, closing in around them like a slow-breathing lung. Laura stepped carefully, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth, the scent of moss and pine needles thick in the air. The gravel crunch of the patrol trail was long gone now, replaced by the muted hush of loam beneath her soles. Ahead of her, the puppy moved in fits and starts, darting forward, then freezing, glancing back at her with those wide, liquid eyes, as if making sure she hadn't abandoned him. Every time their gazes met, Laura felt the same quiet pull inside her chest. He wasn't wandering. This wasn't the aimless stumbling of a lost pup. His paws carried a purpose that far outweighed his tiny body. Ash would take 3 steps, then pause, nose twitching, as though confirming a scent only he could read. Then his head would lift, ears flicking, and he'd glance back, wordlessly commanding her to keep pace. Each check slowed her breathing, as if he were testing whether she deserved to follow. And each time she answered with the only thing she could, a steady step forward, her boots careful not to sound louder than the trust building between them. The forest swallowed sound the deeper they pressed. Birdsong thinned until it became a memory. Even the rustle of squirrels and the buzzing of insects seemed to retreat, leaving behind a silence that pressed in on her ears. Laura caught herself holding her breath without realizing, only to let it out in a slow, controlled stream that misted in the cool air. She watched the pup's shoulders as he moved, tiny muscles working beneath his scruffy coat, determination etched into every stride. There was something almost unbearable about his focus, as though each paw print he left on the forest floor was part of a message too fragile to speak aloud. Laura's hand brushed against a branch, damp leaves whispering against her sleeve. She steadied herself, scanning her surroundings out of habit. Training had wired her to anticipate danger in places like this, blind corners, tangled brush, the way the density of trees could mask more than it revealed. But here, in this silence, the danger she felt wasn't directed at her. It wrapped itself around the pup instead. Whatever destination pulled him forward carried the weight of urgency, of desperation, and Laura could feel it in the marrow of her bones. At one point, Ash stumbled slightly, his tiny paw catching on a root. Laura's heart clenched, instinct pushing her to rush forward. But before she could move, he righted himself. He shook his body, as if to brush off weakness, then padded forward again, pausing just long enough to look back. His gaze seemed to whisper, "I can do this. Just follow." Laura swallowed the knot in her throat. She had followed suspects down alleys, children into danger, victims through chaos. But never had she followed something this small, this vulnerable, with such absolute conviction that he knew better than she did where they needed to go. The forest shifted around them, the light dimming as the canopy grew thicker. Shafts of sunlight broke through only in fractured pieces, painting the ground with pale gold patches that looked almost holy. Shadows moved and pooled in the hollows between tree roots, and the air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the faint mineral smell of stone. Ash stopped abruptly, ears stiffening, body taut. His nose lowered, whiskers twitching as he sniffed the ground. Laura stilled instantly, her own breath shallow, waiting. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass. Then, after a beat, he lifted his head again and pressed forward, glancing back only once to ensure she hadn't faltered. That glance tightened something in her chest. It wasn't just the look of a pup confirming his human was still there. It was the look of a guardian, a messenger, making sure she understood the gravity of what they were walking toward. Branches scraped softly across Laura's vest as she pushed deeper. The further they went, the more the world seemed to fold inward, sounds muffled as though swallowed by thick walls of bark and leaves. She realized she could no longer hear the road behind them, not even in echoes. They were in a different world now, one defined by the rhythm of Ash's paws and the whisper of her own boots. A memory tugged at her uninvited, Her father's voice when she was a child, walking with him on their old hunting trips before he'd aged out of such treks. "Watch how the dog moves," he'd told her. "When it looks back at you, it isn't just checking. It's asking, do you trust me enough to follow?" The weight of that memory pressed heavily now as she watched Ash pause again, his tiny frame quivering but unyielding. The answer came unspoken but absolute. "Yes, I trust you." The path, if it could be called that, grew uneven. Fallen branches littered the ground, roots coiled like veins across the earth. Laura found herself ducking under low boughs, weaving between tree trunks that leaned at odd angles. Each time, she adjusted her steps to match the pup's pace, careful not to outpace him, careful not to let her own impatience fracture the fragile thread pulling them both forward. There was no sound but their journey. The muffled scrape of claws against soil, the hush of boots on damp leaves, and beneath it all, the tension coiled tighter with every yard they covered. Laura realized with a strange certainty that the forest itself seemed to know what was coming. Its silence wasn't empty. It was watchful. Ash stopped once more, his tiny chest rising and falling in rapid bursts. His tail flicked nervously, his ears swiveling. Then he glanced back at her again, eyes dark and wide, and pressed forward without hesitation. Laura followed, her heart thudding harder now, each step an echo of commitment she couldn't yet explain. She was no longer on patrol, no longer walking to pass time. She was being led, step by fragile step, into something far larger than either of them. The silence thickened, pressing against her ears until she swore she could hear her own heartbeat in it. Ahead, Ash's paws pressed onward, small prints in the damp soil that felt less like tracks and more like a map written in urgency. And Laura, with every step, knew she was walking deeper into a truth that would not let her leave unchanged. The air seemed to thicken as they pressed deeper into the forest. The canopy had closed almost entirely overhead, filtering sunlight into fractured beams that fell across the ground in pale ribbons. Each shaft of light revealed a swirl of suspended dust, as if the forest itself had paused to watch. Laura's breath slowed, her ears attuned to the faint crunch of her boots and the quicker patter of Ash's paws. The silence felt heavy now, as though the world were holding its breath. Then Ash stopped. It was sudden, so abrupt that Laura nearly stepped on him. His small body stiffened, muscles quivering beneath his dirt-streaked coat. His oversized ears pricked straight up, their tips trembling ever so slightly. His nose hovered low, pulling in scents with frantic urgency, and his tail dropped stiffly behind him, no longer twitching with uncertainty, but held taut like a wire strung too tight. Laura froze. Instinct ran sharp through her body, the kind that had carried her through a dozen dangerous calls. She scanned the trees, the shadows, the brush. Nothing moved, but she trusted the pup more than the silence. Whatever had stopped him wasn't ordinary. The fallen log appeared before her, draped in moss so thick it looked like velvet in the fractured light. Its trunk lay at an angle, roots clawing upward from the earth like twisted fingers, creating a hollowed-out barricade. The air around it carried the damp smell of rot and old soil, the kind that clung to the nose and left a metallic aftertaste on the tongue. Ash's body lowered slightly, his chest pressing closer to the ground as his paws spread for balance. Then it came. A bark. Sharp. Urgent. Nothing like the whines he had offered earlier. It wasn't playful and wasn't lost. It was a command. A call for attention. Laura's pulse jumped. The sound cut through her chest, reverberating in her ribs. She felt her muscles coil, every nerve on high alert. It was as though the bark itself had drawn an invisible line in the earth. Before the log, ignorance. Beyond it, revelation. Her eyes moved across the moss-covered trunk, searching. From this side, she saw only shadows pooling in the hollow beneath the roots. She swallowed, her throat dry, her hand instinctively hovering near her radio. The training in her blood urged caution. Approach slowly, assess, call for backup if necessary. But another current, a more primal, aching instinct, pushed her forward. Ash barked again, his voice breaking at the edges but no less fierce. The sound cracked the silence like a flare shot into the night. He glanced back at her then, eyes wide and burning with urgency. He didn't need words. That look said everything. It's here. Look. Laura crouched low, steadying herself with a hand against the rough bark of a nearby tree. Her heart thudded against her ribs, each beat too loud in the muted air. She let her gaze sweep the log again, this time slower. At first, it was only branches and earth, a tangle of fallen needles and damp leaves. But the longer she stared, the more a shape began to take form. A curve too deliberate to be debris. A shadow too solid to belong to earth alone. Her pulse quickened. Ash whined now, a low, trembling sound that cracked into the air and cut through her composure. He pawed once at the soil, then stepped forward, nose stretched toward the hollow, as though trying to summon whatever lay beyond. His body quivered with urgency, yet he didn't cross the log. It was as if he needed her to see it, to acknowledge it, before he could move closer. Laura's palms grew damp. She shifted her weight slowly, careful not to startle him or the unseen presence beyond the log. Every instinct screamed that something fragile and terrible waited there, something the pup had carried her into this forest to face. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice low, steadying. "I'm right here." The words were more for herself than for him. The forest pressed closer in response. Even the light seemed to dim, shadows deepening until the log looked like a gateway carved between two worlds. One step over, and she knew she would leave behind the realm of routine, of safety. Ash glanced back once more, his tiny frame trembling but his gaze steady, unyielding. He gave another bark, this one hoarse, raw, filled with something that twisted in her chest. Not warning, not fear, desperation. Laura's hand brushed the cool metal of her badge, grounding herself in its weight. Her other hand tightened around the strap of her vest. She inhaled, drawing in the thick scent of moss and damp pine, steadying her racing thoughts. Then, with a slow exhale, she took one step closer to the log. The ground softened beneath her boots, the soil damp and giving. Ash shifted with her, padding forward just enough to keep his distance from the hollow. His nose twitched violently, his ears trained forward, his whole body vibrating with tension. He whined again, pawing softly at the earth, urging her onward. Laura's chest tightened. Her pulse thundered as she crouched lower, letting her line of sight dip closer to the shadow pooled beneath the log. And there, just for an instant, she saw it. A flicker of fur. Dark, matted. A shape curled in on itself, fragile and broken, half swallowed by the earth. Laura's breath caught. The world around her seemed to dissolve, leaving only the moss-draped log, the trembling pup at her side, and the terrible truth waiting just beyond. Ash barked again, sharp and desperate, his voice cracking under the weight of urgency. Laura's heart answered, racing with dread and certainty. Whatever lay beyond that log was why he had found her. Why did he lead her here? And with that realization she knew, There was no turning back. Laura's knees sank into the damp earth as she leaned forward, her breath caught in her chest. The moss-covered log loomed before her like a barricade between two worlds. On one side, the familiar rhythm of her patrol, the comfort of routine. On the other, the unknown, shadowed and heavy with silence. She lowered herself further, ignoring the sting of branches scraping against her forearms, and peered into the hollow beneath the gnarled roots. What she saw stopped her heart. There, half hidden in the murk, lay the shape of a German shepherd, larger, older, her body curled as if trying to disappear into the soil itself. At first, Laura thought she was gone, no more than an abandoned body claimed by the forest. But then her eyes adjusted. She saw the ragged rise and fall of a chest, faint as a whisper. The dog's fur, once thick and proud, was matted into clumps of dirt and blood. Deep scratches marred her sides, a grim story written across her coat. One hind leg twisted at an angle so unnatural, it made Laura's stomach clench. Every breath the dog drew seemed to cost her more than she had left to give. Ash broke the stillness with a desperate cry. His small body lunged forward, claws scraping against bark as he tried to climb the fallen log. He scrambled clumsily, his paws slipping, his whine cracking into something raw and unbearable. Laura reached instinctively, scooping him up before he could injure himself. He struggled in her arms, tiny muscles straining, his voice high and frantic. "It's okay," Laura whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound steady. "I see her. I see her." But Ash would not be calmed. He twisted against her chest, eyes fixed on the hollow, a pup fighting with everything inside him to get back to his mother. Laura lowered him carefully to the ground on the far side of the log. He bounded forward, his small body pressing desperately against the older dog's neck. He nudged her again and again, pawing gently, whining with every push as though sheer will could summon her back to strength. The sight carved into Laura's heart like a blade. She swallowed hard, fighting the sting in her eyes, and pressed forward on her knees until she was beside them. Her training snapped back into place through the swell of emotion. With steady fingers, she reached toward the mother dog's chest, brushing past the dirt-stiffened fur. She pressed 2 fingers lightly against the fragile curve of ribs, holding her breath. For a terrible second, there was nothing. Then, faint, thready, but there. She felt it. A heartbeat. Laura let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, voice cracking into the forest hush. Ash whimpered louder, licking at his mother's muzzle, pressing himself so tightly against her side, it seemed he was trying to hold her together. His small chest rose and fell in frantic rhythm, his body trembling as though he carried all the fear she couldn't show. "She's alive," Laura whispered again, this time to him. She didn't know if he could understand the words, but the pup stilled for a fraction of a second, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. Then, with renewed urgency, he nudged his mother once more, as if telling her to hang on just a little longer. Laura's hands trembled as she checked for other signs, air moving faintly against her fingers, the sluggish flutter of pulse beneath battered skin. The injuries were brutal, but not yet final. There was a chance, a thin, fragile chance. Her throat tightened. She glanced at Ash, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes wide and wet with a grief too old for a body so young. In that look, she understood what had carried him out of hiding and onto her path. He hadn't been wandering. He hadn't been lost. This tiny, trembling creature had been carrying a mission his body could barely contain. To save his mother. Laura blinked hard, forcing herself into focus. She unclipped her radio with one hand, pressing the button down with fingers that refused to steady. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hayes," she said, her voice sharper than she felt. "North sector, near mile marker 7. I've got 2 canines, 1 adult female, critical condition, 1 juvenile, unharmed but distressed. Request immediate veterinary response and extraction team." Static cracked in her ear, followed by the calm voice of dispatch. "Copy that, Hayes. Hold your position. Help is on the way." Laura clipped the radio back to her vest, her eyes never leaving the 2 dogs. Ash had pressed his entire body along his mother's broken form, his tiny nose buried against her muzzle, as if he could breathe life into her lungs. The older dog stirred faintly at his touch, a whimper so low it barely escaped her throat. But Ash heard it. His ears perked, his body stiffened, and then he let out a whine of pure relief. Laura's chest broke open at the sound. She reached out carefully, her hand resting along Ash's back. He stiffened for half a beat, then leaned into her touch, his trembling easing just slightly, as though borrowing strength from her hand. "You did good," she whispered, her voice soft but steady now. "You held on long enough. She's still here." The forest seemed to breathe with them then, the silence shifting from oppressive to reverent. Light filtered through the canopy in soft beams, settling on the 3 of them in the hollow of roots and moss. For a moment, Laura forgot the world outside. The calls, the patrol, the endless weight of duty. All that existed was a dying mother clinging to breath, a pup refusing to give up, and herself kneeling in the dirt with a heart too full to name. She pressed her hand more firmly against Nora's side, because now the name seemed to whisper itself to her, and felt again the faint flutter of life. It was weak, slipping, but it was there. And as Ash let out another whimper, tucking himself closer, Laura made a silent vow into the stillness. "I won't let her slip away. Not while you're still fighting for her. Not while I'm here." The forest pressed in around them, heavy and hushed, as if it too understood the fragile line being walked between life and loss. Laura's knees ached from the damp soil, but she hardly noticed. Her hand still hovered against the battered chest of the injured shepherd, feeling the faint, unsteady flutter of a heartbeat. It was there, barely, but enough. Enough to mean the difference between surrender and a fight worth waging. Beside her, Ash trembled against his mother, whining softly, nudging her muzzle with desperate persistence. Each small sound carved into Laura's chest like a blade. He had led her here for this, to bear witness, to help, and now everything depended on how quickly she could summon the right kind of aid. Her fingers found the radio clipped to her vest. They shook, not from fear of the forest, but from the sheer weight of what she held in her hands. This was no longer about routine patrols, no longer about regulations or checklists. This was about a heartbeat that could vanish in the space between words. She pressed the button, holding it down, and forced her voice steady. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hayes." Her tone came sharp, professional, but her throat felt raw. "I need immediate assistance. North sector, near mile marker 7. I've located 2 canines, 1 adult German shepherd, critical condition, 1 juvenile, unharmed but severely distressed. Request urgent veterinary response and extraction team. Over." The radio crackled with static, stretching the silence longer than she could bear. Her eyes dropped back to the dog sprawled in the hollow. The blood matted into her fur, the twisted leg bent wrong, the faint tremor of her ribs. It all felt like a countdown. Ash whimpered louder, his tiny body pressing harder against his mother's side. Laura's free hand found his back, stroking along the ridge of his spine in small, steady motions. "Hold on, little one," she murmured. "We've got help coming. Just hold on." Finally, dispatch answered. The calm, practiced voice cut through the static. "Copy that, Hayes. Veterinary unit and animal rescue en route. ETA 20 minutes. Can you stabilize until they arrive? 20 minutes. The number punched through her chest like a fist. 20 minutes felt impossibly long when a life was measured in shallow, broken breaths. She pressed the button again, her words clipped but urgent. She's in bad shape. Blood loss, shock, possible fractures. Pulse is weak, but present. I'll do what I can, but I need that team moving fast. Repeat. Critical condition. Please advise them to prepare for immediate trauma response. Understood, the voice replied, steady as stone. We'll update the team. Stay put. Keep her stable if possible. We're with you, Hayes. The radio hissed into silence. Laura clipped it back to her vest, exhaling shakily. Her hand trembled against the pup's back, and she curled her fingers into the fabric of her pants to steady herself. Professional composure demanded she stay calm, efficient, precise. But beneath the badge, beneath the uniform, her heart ached. She had answered countless calls before, pulled people from wrecks, sat with children until the ambulance came. But this, kneeling in the dirt beside a dying dog while her pup refused to leave her side, felt different. It was raw, stripped down to love in its most desperate form. Ash pressed his small nose against his mother's muzzle again, whimpering as though trying to call her back. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "She's still here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "As long as there's a heartbeat, she's still here." She reached for her belt, pulling free the small emergency kit she carried. Human tools, not meant for this, but it was all she had. Gauze pads, antiseptic wipes, bandages. She pressed one gently against a wound along the shepherd's flank, where blood still seeped. The fur was clotted, sticky, her gloves slick with it. She held the pad there, firm but careful, praying it would slow the loss until help arrived. Ash whimpered louder at the movement, his ears flattening. "I know," Laura murmured, stroking his head. "I know it hurts to see, but we've got to give her a chance." The forest around them had gone utterly still, as though listening. Every sound felt amplified. The faint buzz of her radio, the shallow rasp of the mother's breath, the quick, panicked rhythm of Ash's whine. Laura's own heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she forced her hands steady, refusing to let the pup see her falter. "Dispatch," she whispered to no one, to herself. "Don't let them take 20 minutes. Please." The shepherd stirred faintly beneath her touch, a soft whimper escaping her throat. Ash froze, his head snapping up, ears rigid. Then he let out a sound Laura would never forget, a cry that was neither bark nor whine, but something in between, raw and piercing. Relief, grief, hope, tangled in one small voice. Laura's eyes burned. She bent lower, speaking softly to both of them. "You're not alone anymore. You hear me? She's not alone. You brought me here, and I'm not leaving." Her words cracked in the quiet, but she didn't care. She wasn't just talking to a pup. She was making a vow. The minutes stretched like hours, each one heavy with the fragile weight of a life balanced on the edge. Laura kept her hand pressed firmly against the wound, her body hunched protectively over both dogs, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure they understood. But she needed to say them all the same. When the faint wail of a siren finally drifted through the trees, distant but undeniable, Laura's chest collapsed with relief. Her radio crackled again, the dispatcher's voice confirming what she already knew. Help was close. She pressed her forehead briefly against Ash's trembling back, her whisper barely more than breath. "You did it, little one. You found me. Now we're going to save her." And with that, she braced herself. The hardest part was still ahead. Ash pressed his tiny body against the battered shepherd, unwilling to move even an inch. His paws dug into the soil as if he could anchor her to this world with his touch alone. He nudged her muzzle again and again, his small whines cracking into the heavy silence, each one a plea, each one a command. Wake up, don't leave me, stay. Laura had seen grief before. She had seen it spill out of children who clung to stuffed bears in the back of ambulances, in the hollow-eyed silence of parents who had lost everything. But this was grief and loyalty, distilled into the fragile body of a pup too young to understand death, yet somehow old enough to fight it with every fiber of his being. Her throat tightened as she watched him work, pawing at Nora's face, nudging her side, pressing his little body so firmly against hers that he trembled with the effort. His whimpers pierced her heart in a way sirens and screams never had. Laura reached forward, sliding a hand under his chest, trying to coax him back. "Easy, Ash," she whispered. She didn't even know when the name had taken root, only that it fit him, the small ember glowing against the dark. But Ash resisted. His paws scrabbled against the earth, his claws clicking faintly on roots and stone as he tried to wriggle free from her grip. He twisted his head, crying louder now, refusing to give her his body if it meant leaving his mother's side. His desperation was so fierce that Laura almost let him go. So instead, she shifted her approach. She slid closer, lowering herself until she was on the ground with him. Her body curled protectively around them both, one arm encircling Ash, but leaving him pressed against Nora's chest. She could feel the faint vibration of her heartbeat beneath the pup's weight, so weak, so fragile, but still there. "See?" Laura murmured, resting her forehead against the back of Ash's trembling neck. "She's still here. You're helping her. You're doing good." The words were cracked around the edges, but she needed him to believe them. She needed to believe them herself. Ash quieted for only a moment, his whines softening into broken breaths. Then he pawed again at Nora's chest, his claws snagging in the tangled fur. He pressed his nose against her muzzle, licking her once, then twice, before letting out a sound that made Laura's chest ache so sharply she pressed a hand there. It was a cry no one should ever have to make. Not a child, not a pup. "You're her guardian, aren't you?" Laura whispered, her eyes wet. "You led me here. You didn't think about yourself once. You just wanted her safe." The realization struck her with the force of truth. She had thought at first he was a lost puppy, wandering aimlessly, clinging to the hope of finding someone to help him. But she had been wrong. He hadn't been lost. He had been on a mission. Too small, too fragile, yet somehow determined enough to see it through. His goal had never been rescue for himself. It had always been for her, his mother. Her voice thickened, catching on the weight of it. "You've been out here all this time, fighting to find someone who would listen." She stroked his back gently, her hand moving in slow circles to calm his frantic trembling. "You're braver than anyone I've ever met." Ash let out another whine and pressed his face harder against Nora's side, as though burrowing into her body could keep her alive. Laura closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a shaky breath, letting the scent of pine and blood and damp earth fill her lungs. She wanted to weep, but she couldn't, not yet, not in front of him. He needed her steady. "Listen to me, Ash," she whispered, her words low and certain despite the crack in her chest. "You found me. You did your part. Now it's my turn." He stilled at the sound of her voice, his ears flicking back. For a heartbeat, the trembling in his small body eased. Then he shifted, leaning into her touch for the first time, though he never moved away from his mother. Laura felt her heart split open at that small gesture of trust. She had promised countless victims that they weren't alone. But this promise, made to a pup with dirt-streaked fur and two knowing eyes, felt heavier than any she had ever spoken. She bent closer to Nora, her hand hovering near the weak rise and fall of her chest. "She's holding on, Ash. She's fighting. Just like you." The pup whimpered softly, his voice breaking into silence. He tucked himself tighter against his mother, his eyes closing as though he could lend her his strength by sheer will. His breathing hitched, shallow but determined, as though he had decided he would carry both their lives until help arrived. Laura cradled him closer with one arm, keeping her other hand firmly pressed to the makeshift bandage at Nora's wound. She had no illusions. Her supplies were limited, her training stretched thin, but she refused to let despair in. Not here. Not while a trembling pup had shown more courage than most adults she had ever met. "Hold on," she whispered to them both, her voice steadier now. "Just hold on. Help is coming. And I promise, you're not alone anymore." The forest around them stayed silent, reverent. A single shaft of light broke through the canopy, falling across the three of them, Laura kneeling in the dirt, a dying mother clinging to life, and her guardian pup refusing to let go. And in that stillness, Laura knew with absolute certainty that this was no accident. Fate had led her here, but Ash had carried the weight of it, step by trembling step, until he found her. His mission was never about himself. It had always been about love. The forest had grown so quiet that Laura could hear the faintest rasp of Nora's breath, the soft scrape of Ash's paws as he shifted against his mother, unwilling to leave her side. Time had turned viscous, stretching thin. Each second pressed down on her chest like a weight. She kept one hand on Nora's wound, the other curled protectively around Ash's trembling body, whispering reassurances she prayed he could feel if not understood. Then, at last, the silence broke. It started as a faint hum, distant wheels crunching against gravel. Then came the muffled roar of an engine, the crackle of tires over dirt. Laura's heart lurched. She strained her ears, her pulse racing. The sound grew closer, clearer, until the faint wail of a siren threaded through the trees, low and muted beneath the canopy. Relief surged hot and sharp, stealing her breath. "They're here," she whispered, though her voice cracked. Ash's ears twitched, his head lifting, but his body never left his mother's side. Moments later, beams of light pierced the shadows, flashlights cut through the dense brush, voices called to one another, urgent, low, practiced. The rescue team emerged like figures conjured from another world, their uniforms streaked with mud, their eyes scanning quickly until they found her kneeling beside the fallen log. "Officer Hayes," one of them called, stepping forward. His face was lined with concern, his gaze darting from her to the two dogs huddled against the earth. "Here," Laura answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Critical condition. She's still alive, but barely." The team moved with the swift precision of people who had seen too much, but still carried hope in their hands. Two animal rescue officers pushed forward with a stretcher, while a mobile vet knelt immediately beside Laura, her kit unzipped before her knees touched the ground. Her face tightened the moment her eyes landed on Nora's twisted leg, the blood-matted fur. She muttered something under her breath, then got to work. Ash stiffened at the intrusion. His small body pressed harder against his mother's side, ears flat, a growl bubbling in his tiny throat. When the vet reached forward with practiced hands, Ash lunged, snapping, not out of malice, but out of desperate protection. Laura caught him just in time, scooping him against her chest. "Easy, little one, easy." His body shook violently in her arms, his cries sharp and frantic. His eyes locked on Nora as though she were being stolen from him, and his paws clawed at the air, desperate to get back. "She's critical, but we've got a pulse," the vet said briskly, wrapping gauze around the worst of the wounds. "We'll stabilize for transport. Keep that pup back, he's panicking." "I've got him," Laura replied, tightening her hold. Ash squirmed, yelping, his voice cutting through the clearing like shattered glass. "Hey," she whispered against his ear, rocking him slightly as though he were a child. "She's not gone. They're helping her. That's all this is. Help. Do you hear me? You found me, and now you've found them. Let them do their part." But Ash didn't understand words. What he understood was presence. So Laura gave him what she could. Warmth, heartbeat, arms that refused to let him go. She pressed him close to her chest until his frantic kicks slowed, until his sharp cries melted into whines muffled against her vest. His trembling remained, but it was different now, softer, almost like surrender. Meanwhile, the vet worked quickly, sliding a splint along Nora's twisted leg, securing her chest with bandages to slow the bleeding. Another rescuer adjusted the stretcher's straps, glancing at Laura with grim eyes. "She's hanging by a thread," he murmured. "But she's still hanging." Laura nodded once, her jaw tight. She didn't dare speak. She feared her voice would betray her. When the team lifted Nora onto the stretcher, Ash let out a sound that broke every heart in earshot. It was high, raw, torn straight from his small body. His paws flailed against Laura's arms, desperate to follow, his cries echoing through the trees with a desperation no human language could match. Laura's chest split at the sound. She tightened her hold, whispering through the storm of his grief. "She's not leaving you, Ash. You're going with her. I promise. I won't let them take her without you." The pup's cries quieted only slightly, his tiny head tucking beneath her chin. She felt his tears. Warm, wet, silent now. Soak into the fabric of her uniform. She held him tighter, one hand stroking his dirt-streaked back in slow circles, rocking him gently, even as the team secured Nora to the stretcher. "Vitals are faint, but stable for now," the vet announced. "Let's move. Every second counts." Laura followed as they lifted Nora, her boots heavy in the soft soil, her arms carrying the pup who refused to be comforted by anything but proximity to his mother. Ash twisted once in her hold, managing to peek over her arm. When he saw the stretcher, his cries returned, softer this time, but no less aching. Laura pressed her cheek against his head, whispering into his ear. "You're still with her. Do you feel that? She's still breathing. You've done everything you could. Now let them carry her the rest of the way." The forest opened slightly as the team pushed forward, their flashlights carving bright paths through the dark. Branches snapped underfoot. The stretcher swayed, and still Ash stared, his wide eyes fixed on his mother. Only when Laura's voice filled his ears again, steady and low, did his trembling begin to ease. By the time they reached the vehicle, Ash had curled into Laura's arms, his breaths shallow but slower, his small body finally surrendering to the safety of her hold. His gaze never left Nora, but his frantic fight had softened into quiet endurance. And Laura, holding him tighter than she'd ever held anything in her life, whispered the promise she knew she would spend the rest of her days keeping. "She's not leaving you. Not today. Not while I'm here." The clearing was no more than a patch of flattened ferns, the ground damp with moss, and the air sharp with urgency. The team laid Nora gently on the stretcher, every movement swift, controlled. The mobile vet dropped to her knees, hands already reaching for supplies. Laura hovered close, clutching Ash. The pup squirmed desperately, his cries high and frantic, cutting through the quiet forest. His mother lay only feet away, chest rising unevenly, and he couldn't understand why he wasn't allowed near her. "Easy, little one," Laura whispered, tightening her grip as his small body kicked and clawed, but Ash's whole being narrowed to one truth: he had to reach her. "IV line, now," the vet ordered. Fluids began dripping into Nora's foreleg, followed quickly by a syringe of pain relief. The shepherd twitched and whimpered faintly. Ash's cries sharpened, lunging harder against Laura's hold. "She's okay," Laura murmured fiercely, lips pressed to his ear. "They're helping her." He couldn't know promises, only fear. "Ma'am," a rescuer warned gently. "He needs to stay calm. If he gets loose—" "I know," Laura choked. She pressed him tighter, his heartbeat slamming against her chest. "You're not losing her. Not here." "Her temperature's dropping," the vet said. Blankets were draped over Nora's trembling frame. Ash quieted for a heartbeat, then keened louder when her breathing hitched shallow again. The vet bent low, stethoscope pressed to chest. "Her heart's weak, but she's fighting. We can't move her yet." Ash froze at the steadiness in the voice, then cried again, burying his face into Laura's chest. She rocked him, instinctively whispering, "She's here." "She's still here. You did your job, Ash. Now let them do theirs." His sobs softened to ragged whines, body sagging reluctantly against her arms. On the stretcher, Nora stirred faintly, lips trembling in a ghost of a whine. Ash stiffened, then answered with a cry so raw, Laura nearly broke down. "She's answering you," Laura whispered, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time, the vet's face softened. "That bond, it might be what's keeping her alive." At last the vet straightened. "She's stable enough for transport. Thin line, but we can move her." Laura exhaled, kissing the top of Ash's head. "Hear that? She's holding on." He whimpered, but leaned into her arms, eyes locked on Nora as they lifted the stretcher. The back doors of the van slammed shut, cutting off the forest. Inside, disinfectant and copper filled the air. Nora lay swaddled in blankets, IV dripping steadily. The vet crouched close, eyes never still. The van jolted forward. Ash spasmed against Laura's chest, claws digging into her uniform, eyes never leaving his mother. "She's right here," Laura murmured. "Don't let go now." The vet's voice was clipped, urgent. "Her vitals are weak but holding. Keep him calm. Panic won't help her." "I'll hold him," Laura said, and meant more than his body. She would hold his fear, his hope, all of it. A rut in the dirt road jolted the van. Ash yelped, gaze snapping to Nora, crying out sharp. Laura rocked him gently. "It's okay. Look, they're watching her. They won't let her slip." Her eyes betrayed her words, darting again and again to Nora's faint chest rise, but she buried her fear, turning it into steadiness for Ash. The vet worked relentlessly, adjusting lines, listening, and murmuring vitals. Another rescuer steadied the stretcher through every sway. The air felt pulled taut between despair and hope. Gradually, Ash's cries softened to shallow breaths, still trembling, but anchored by Laura's steady touch. And she stroked his back in circles, heartbeat steady against his ear. "You're stronger than most grown men," she whispered thickly. "You found me. You gave her a chance." Her tears finally slipped free, soaking into his fur. For once, she didn't hide them. The vet looked up suddenly. "She's stabilizing. Heart's weak, but we've bought time." Laura's breath cracked out. "Hear that? She's holding on, just like you." The van rumbled on. Ash's trembling eased, his breathing sinking to Laura's chest. For the first time, He didn't cry, just watched, silent and fierce, clinging to the only anchor he had left. At the clinic, bright lights and antiseptic swallowed them. Nora was wheeled deeper, techs swarming with instruments. Fractured leg, blood loss, possible internal injuries. The vet barked. Laura lingered at the threshold, Ash still in her arms, whimpering as the distance grew. "They're helping her," she whispered. But he dug claws into her vest, crying as the stretcher vanished. She was ushered into the waiting room, white walls, plastic chairs, the sterile smell of bleach. She sank into a corner, Ash restless in her lap, nose searching her uniform for his mother's scent. Laura stroked his back like a soundless lullaby. Time stretched thin. The muffled clink of surgery drifted through doors. Each sound stabbed through the silence. Ash never stopped watching the door, ears pricking at every opening, sagging each time it closed without her. Laura's chest ached with each disappointment. She leaned her forehead against his. "She's not gone. She's fighting for you, just like you fought for her." Her tears broke freely, soaking his fur. He didn't understand tears, but closeness steadied him. For the first time since arriving, he stopped whimpering, curling tighter into her lap, finally sagging into an uneasy doze. Laura stayed still, sentinel-like, whispering to herself, "She's going to make it. She has to." Hours dragged. A nurse brought water she didn't drink. The vet appeared briefly, sweat-streaked. "We've stabilized her vitals. Surgery's in progress," she said, then vanished again. Laura nodded numbly. Stabilized. In progress. Nothing sounded safe. She pressed her forehead to Ash's again. She's still fighting. When the door finally opened again, Laura shot upright, Ash jolting awake in her arms. The vet stepped out, exhaustion carved into her face, but eyes glimmering with relief. "She's out of surgery, long road ahead, but she made it through the night." Ash whimpered, catching his mother's faint scent drifting from the open door. He scrabbled against Laura's arms, desperate. Laura exhaled a shuddering breath, kissing his head. "She made it. You kept her here, Ash. You did it." And for the first time since the forest, hope stirred, not certain, not secure, but alive. The clinic was quieter the next morning, silence stretched like a breath held too long. The chaos of the night had faded into the steadier rhythm of recovery. Machines hummed softly behind closed doors, monitors tracing life in pale green. Outside, dawn spilled gold through frosted glass, softening the harsh edges of sterile walls. Laura sat in the corner of the observation room, still in her uniform, badge dulled with smudges of dirt and blood. She had refused to leave. Ash was curled tightly in her lap. His body finally surrendered to sleep, though even in dreams he twitched, as if worry still clung to him. On the bed lay the older shepherd, bandaged and blanketed, impossibly fragile, but breathing. Wires and tubes tethered her to machines that pulsed out their fragile promises. She was here, alive. A young vet tech entered, quiet as a whisper, carrying a clipboard and fluids. "She made it through the night stronger than expected," she said softly. "She's fighting." "Both of them are." Laura's hand brushed Ash's back. "They've been fighting long before I found them." The tech hesitated, then crouched. "We should call them something. They deserve more than just the female and the pup." The words struck Laura. Until now they'd been survivors, stories written in blood and dirt. But they weren't just that. They were alive, souls. They had carried each other through darkness. For her, maybe Nora, the tech said, adjusting the blanket. "It means light. She's been through so much, but she's still shining." Laura repeated the name softly, looking at the faint rise of the shepherd's chest. "Yes. Nora Fitz." Ash stirred faintly in her lap, paws twitching, as if the name reached him. "And for the little one," the tech continued, "what about Ash? Fragile, but born from fire. Ashes mean something ended, but also that something new can begin." Laura's throat tightened. She looked at the pup curled against her chest, ears too big, fur streaked with dirt. The name felt as though it had always been his. "Ash," she whispered. The puppy whimpered softly, pressing closer, as if recognizing it. Laura kissed the top of his head. "Ash," she repeated, then, looking back at the bed, "And Nora." The names filled the room with something warmer than medicine. Survivors. Mother and son, bound by love that refused to yield. The tech smiled, scribbling onto her chart. "They'll need those names when they're strong enough to go home." Home. The word hit heavy in Laura's chest. She hadn't let herself picture a future beyond waiting rooms and monitors. But now, with Ash pressed close and Nora breathing steady, she couldn't imagine a future without them. Ash's eyes blinked open. His gaze snapped to the bed, softening with relief at the rise and fall of Nora's chest. He gave a tired whine before settling back into Laura's arms. She stroked his head gently. "You're Ash now, and she's Nora. You both have names, because you both have futures." For the first time in days, she let herself believe it. The days after surgery fell into rhythm, though nothing felt ordinary. Laura's life, once marked by patrols and lonely nights, now revolved around a sterile recovery room. Each day after her shift, sometimes with dirt still on her boots, she came here. The first time, her heart hammered as she pushed open the clinic door. The waiting room smelled of coffee gone cold. Her hand scrawled her name on the clipboard, but her mind was already down the hall. The door creaked open, and Ash launched himself at her, ears flopping, tail wagging so hard his body swayed. He yipped once before tumbling headfirst into her lap. "Hey, little one," she murmured, laughing through tears. His small tongue darted frantically, as if to convince himself she was real. On the low bed, Nora stirred. She didn't move much, her body still stiff with pain, but her eyes softened when they found Laura. A faint lift of her head, no more than a breath, but it hit Laura like a flood. "You too," she whispered, one hand still stroking Ash. "I see you." Every day after that, the ritual repeated. Ash waited for her, as though minutes were years, launching into her arms with relief so fierce it bruised. Laura dropped to the floor without hesitation, gathering him close, and every day Nora lifted her head, sometimes barely an inch, sometimes long enough to track Laura's every move. Once she even let out a faint whine when Laura touched her side, not despair, but greeting, recognition, proof that she knew Laura kept coming back. "She's calmer when you're here," a tech remarked one afternoon. "The pup too. They wait for you." Laura could only nod, throat tight. She already knew. Ash healed quickest, his playfulness growing bolder by the day. He tugged at her bootlaces, dragged empty cups across the floor, tail wagging wildly. But no matter how far he played, he never strayed long from Nora's side. If she whimpered, he pressed back against her chest, anchoring her with love. Laura often sat cross-legged on the cool tile. Ash sprawled in her lap, one hand resting on Nora's side, feeling the slow rhythm of her breaths. In those quiet hours, she realized she wasn't just holding them, they were holding her too. Her solitude, once heavy with silence, eased in their presence. Nights in her cabin had been filled with nothing but wind in the wood. She had told herself she liked it that way, But sitting here, pup asleep in her lap, a shepherd's chest rising under her palm, she felt something she hadn't in years. Belonging. One evening, rain-soaked and weary, she arrived to find Ash bounding toward her, paws muddy from a walk. He leapt into her lap, streaking her uniform with dirt. She only laughed, burying her face in his damp fur. "Mess and all, huh? I'll take you like this." From the bed, Nora sighed faintly, eyes drifting shut again, reassured by the sound of laughter. Laura stayed until visiting hours ended, legs stiff, clothes soaked. None of it mattered. What mattered was the pup in her lap, the mother beside her, and the fragile rhythm of healing. Every night, before leaving, she whispered the same words. "I'll be back tomorrow. Count on it." And both Nora and Ash seemed to believe her. The clinic became a second home. Sometimes she arrived straight from patrol, boots scuffed, jacket damp. Other times from her cabin, hair loose, shoulders slumped with fatigue. However she came, she always ended the same way, on the floor, with Ash curled tight in her lap and Nora breathing steady beside them. Ash clung to her at first, breaths shallow, still wired with fear. But as her hand traced his back in slow circles, his breathing deepened. Eventually he melted into sleep, sighing against her. Nora healed slower. Each day was a fragile victory. Yet her eyes softened when Laura entered, flickers of light breaking through exhaustion. Sometimes she nudged closer, as if trying to close the gap. Other times she simply lay still, letting Laura's presence anchor her. Laura's hand often rested on her chest, not pressing, just grounding. Warmth beneath her palm was proof she was still here. Proof that Ash's fight had not been in vain. Hours blurred. Staff came and went. Machines beeped their mechanical heartbeat. Sometimes Laura spoke. Sometimes she sat in silence. Either way, the bond deepened. It struck her one night, in the quiet. She had come because they needed her. But as Ash breathed against her lap, and Nora sighed softly, she realized the need wasn't one-sided. Her life had been carved by solitude. She had convinced herself distance was safety. But here, dirt on her uniform, fur clinging to her clothes, she felt something raw and undeniable. She needed them too. "You need me," she whispered, voice breaking. "But I need you too." Ash stirred, paw twitching against her arm. Nora sighed, eyes half closing, as though acknowledging her words. Laura bent her head, cheek against Ash's fur. "We're a family now," she murmured. "Like it or not. You pulled me into this, and I'm not letting go." Later, Yvette paused at the doorway, watching silently before speaking. "They trust you," she said. Laura met her eyes, nodding softly. "And I trust them." The vet smiled faintly. "That's rare. After trauma, animals often cling only to each other, but they've chosen you. That bond, it's special." When the door closed, Laura let the words settle. Special, bond. She had once convinced herself she didn't need either. But sitting there, Ash asleep, Nora breathing steady, she couldn't deny it. This wasn't just healing for them. It was healing for her. The night stretched on. Machines hummed. Ash slept deeply. Nora dozed in fragile strength. Laura stayed, unwilling to move, unwilling to break the magic of the moment. She no longer needed words. The bond was already there, unspoken but absolute, sealed not by duty but by love, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. The clinic walls seemed closer on therapy days, their white surfaces reflecting every strained breath and muffled cry. Nora trembled on the padded floor, thin beneath her bandages, eyes clouded with both pain and determination. Dr. Marin crouched nearby, voice steady. "One step, girl, just one." Laura knelt a few feet away, Ash in her arms. but the moment Nora shifted, the pup wriggled free, scrambling across the mat to her side. His tiny paws pressed against her muzzle, tongue darting out as if kisses could erase the agony written into her body. Nora tried. She set weight gingerly on her mended leg. The first step ended in collapse, a sharp whine ripping from her throat. Ash cried instantly, nudging, licking, circling frantically as though his sheer will could keep her standing. Laura's eyes burned. She wanted to stop it, to cradle Nora back into safety. But Maren shook her head. She has to try. If she doesn't, she won't walk again. So Nora struggled up once more. Step by agonizing step, she moved forward. Trembling, faltering, but refusing to give up. After 3 steps, she sank heavily to the mat. Ash barked softly, scrambling into her chest, licking furiously as if to pour life back into her. Laura slid closer, one hand on Nora's shoulder, the other calming Ash. "You're okay," she whispered, voice cracking. "This hurts now, but it's the beginning." Maren nodded quietly. "She's stronger than she looks, and with him, she'll keep fighting." Nora lay panting, body shaking with effort. Ash curled tight against her, nose buried in her fur as though to lend her breath. Laura rested her hand on Nora's ribs, feeling the rapid, uneven rhythm beneath. In that fragile circle, a broken mother, a loyal pup, and a woman who could no longer imagine life without them. The pain didn't feel like defeat. It felt like proof. Laura bent close, her words a vow. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. None of us do." Ash whined softly. Nora leaned faintly into her palm, and the moment became something more than survival. It became trust. Later, the clinic had quieted. Nora lay stretched on her bed, leg awkward but steadier, Ash curled against her side. Laura sat on the floor, exhaustion pressing heavy, but her heart alive. The door opened softly. "Doctor." Maren stepped in with a clipboard, checked Nora's IV, then crouched beside Laura instead of hurrying on. "You're here every day," she said, not accusing, just observing. Laura gave a humorless laugh. "They need me. And maybe you need them too," Maren replied gently. The words landed like truth. Laura stared at her boots, scuffed with dried mud, then at her trembling hands. She'd built her life on being strong, on walking into chaos and holding it together. But here, beside a battered shepherd and her pup, she couldn't hide the cracks. "I live out in a cabin," she admitted, surprising herself. "It's quiet, too quiet most nights." Maren waited. "After years on the force, you learn to carry things," Laura said slowly. "The calls, the faces you can't forget, and then you come home to nothing. Just 4 walls and your own thoughts. You start telling yourself that's safer, no one to lose. Just you." Her voice faltered. Nora stirred faintly, sighing in her sleep. Ash pressed closer, his paw draped protectively across her muzzle, even in dreams. "When I found them, Ash led me like his life depended on it. But it wasn't his life he was fighting for. It was hers. He didn't care about himself. He just wanted someone to save her." Laura's throat tightened. "And the truth is, it saved me too. Being there, having them." Maren set her clipboard aside, lowering herself to the floor. "Most people come here wanting to give animals up. Too much work, too much noise, too much need. But you're here because you can't walk away. That says something." Laura gave a shaky laugh. "It says, I'm tired of being alone." "No," Maren corrected softly. "It says, You were never meant to be." The words cut deep. Laura leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. For so long she had worn solitude like armor, convincing herself distance was control. But listening to Nora's breaths and feeling Ash's tiny body pressed to his mother, she realized how hollow that armor was. "They belong with me," she whispered. Maren nodded. "Then fight for them the way they fought for each other." Laura opened her eyes, meeting her gaze. "Saving them feels like saving myself." "Maybe it is," Maren said simply. The room settled into silence. Vet, officer, broken mother, loyal pup, woven together by something fragile but healing. Laura reached out, resting a hand on Nora's side, stroking Ash's back with the other. Their warmth seeped into her bones. She wasn't alone anymore, and she never wanted to be again. Weeks passed. The therapy room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rubber mats, air suspended between pain and progress. Nora stood shakily at the center, bandaged leg trembling. Maren guided her harness with gentle coaxing. Laura knelt nearby, Ash sitting taut at her side. He seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, silence stretching around them. "Easy, girl," Maren murmured. "Just one step." Nora's chest heaved. She pressed gingerly onto her mended leg. For a moment, her body wavered, dipping low. Ash whined, scrambling forward until Laura caught him with one hand. "Wait, let her try." Nora steadied. Muscles shuddered, but her paw pressed firmer against the mat. She lifted her head, ears twitching. Then, with effort rippling visibly through her frame, she stood, fully, shaking, tail low, but standing. Laura gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Tears stung her eyes. Ash froze too, as though stunned. Then, suddenly, a sound burst from him, a sharp, high bark. Playful, bright, his whole body jolted with it, tail whipping like a banner. He barked again, louder, bouncing on the mat as though he could dance his mother into strength. The room stilled. The nurses paused. Maren froze mid-step. Laura lowered her hands, awe breaking across her face. Ash hadn't barked since the forest. Not when begging for help, not through panic and grief. His voice had only whined and cried. But this was joy. Unbroken, unfiltered joy. Nora turned her head, eyes finding her pup. Exhaustion dragged at her, but her tail gave the faintest twitch, a ghost of acknowledgement. Ash yipped again, bounding in circles, tail wagging furiously. Laura's tears spilled freely. "Oh, Ash," she whispered, voice breaking. It wasn't just relief. It was a rebirth. A pup who had carried fear heavier than his body could bear was free enough to bark again. Not in desperation, but in joy. He bounded to Nora, pressed against her leg, tail wagging as if to cheer her on. She wavered, nearly too weak to hold, but Ash's excitement seemed to pour strength into her. She braced again, still upright. Maren exhaled, a smile breaking across her face. "That's it, girl. That's progress." Laura laughed through tears, crouching with arms open. Ash bounced to her, colliding with her chest, barking again as he licked her chin. She hugged him tight, sobs shaking into laughter. "You're back. Both of you. You're really back." Ash wriggled free, racing between them, bounding from his mother to Laura, bridging the two souls who had saved him as surely as he'd saved them. Laura stayed on her knees, tears dripping freely. For so long she had lived inside shadows, silence, loneliness, survival stripped bare. And now, in this small room, she was watching something brighter take root. Ash barked again, sharp and gleeful, echoing off the walls. It wasn't just a noise, it was a promise that the darkness hadn't won, that the love which carried him through the forest was strong enough to carry them all into something new. Nora trembled, then collapsed gently onto the mat. But the triumph lingered. She had stood, she had fought, and her pup had celebrated her victory with the voice he had hidden for so long. Laura knelt beside them, stroking fur damp with sweat. "This isn't just survival," she whispered reverently. "This is the start of everything." Ash licked her hand once, then pressed against Nora's chest, eyes bright and alive. And for the first time since the forest, Laura didn't just feel hope. She felt joy. The night had swallowed the town by the time Laura left the clinic. The air was cold, carrying pine and damp asphalt. Street lamps carved pale cones of light onto the empty road. For a long moment she stood in the parking lot, hands braced against the hood of her truck, staring at her reflection in the windshield. Behind her, the clinic windows glowed faintly. Inside, Nora was resting after another therapy session. Ash curled at her side like a shadow refusing to let go. She climbed into the driver's seat. The engine rumbled, but the sound rang hollow. The road wound toward her cabin through looming pines, shadows rattling in the wind. Once, this silence had been a refuge. Tonight it was too heavy. She thought of Ash's bark when Nora first stood, of Nora's sigh of recognition each time she entered, of the pup tumbling into her lap every evening, joy and relief fused in one frantic body. The images struck like waves. She gripped the wheel harder. "Don't get attached," she muttered, an old warning she had lived by. Yet even as she said it, she knew it was broken. She was attached. Mist curled across the headlights, swirling like ghosts. She slowed, breath tightening. You can't let them go. The thought was sharp, undeniable. She remembered the first night, Ash trembling on the trail, dragging her toward his dying mother. Nora's heartbeat under blood and dirt. Ash's cries when the stretcher lifted her away, his body only calming when pressed against Laura's chest. They weren't memories she could shelve like case reports. They were family now. Her cabin came into view, windows dark and hollow. She parked, silence thick. For years, this cabin's quiet had been safety. Now it looked like emptiness. Her chest ached as she whispered the truth aloud. "I can't let them go." The words didn't feel like weakness. They felt like a vow. Saving Nora and Ash wasn't duty anymore. It was salvation, for all three of them. She leaned her forehead to the wheel, eyes wet, and for once she didn't hear loneliness in the forest's rustle. She heard a promise. Tomorrow she will return to the clinic. Tomorrow she would sit on the floor again, Ash in her lap, her hand on Nora's side. But tonight, she knew the truth had already taken root. She wasn't walking alone anymore. Morning brought coffee drifting from the staff lounge, and sunlight striping the waiting room in pale gold. Laura sat stiffly in a chair, uniform pressed, restless energy thrumming. A clipboard rested on her lap, forms stacked neatly. Just paper and ink, but heavier than any report she had ever signed. "You don't have to decide today," Maren said gently, though her smile betrayed what she already knew. Laura let out a soft laugh. "I decided the moment I found them in the woods. This just makes it official." Through the glass, she saw Nora in her recovery bed, chest rising steady, leg wrapped carefully. Ash lay curled tight against her, nose pressed into her fur, ears twitching for footsteps he seemed to always expect. Laura set pen to paper, Laura Hayes, adopter. The next line, Nora, German Shepherd. She paused, then wrote it slowly, as though carving permanence into the page. Light, a name born in pain, carried now as a beacon. The next, Ash, German Shepherd. A spark from fire, fragile but unyielding. She whispered it aloud as she wrote, stitching them closer still. At the signature line, her hand trembled. She pressed the pen firmly. Ink dried into permanence, but it felt like blood, like vow. Maren slipped the folder away. That's it. They're yours. Laura exhaled shakily. It feels bigger than that. It is, Maren said softly. You didn't just give them a home. You gave yourself one, too. Laura couldn't answer. Instead, she crossed the hall and opened the recovery room door. Ash's head snapped up, tail thumping wildly, before he launched himself into her lap. She caught him, laughing through tears. Hey, Ash, guess what? You're stuck with me now. Behind them, Nora stirred. Exhaustion dulled her, but her eyes softened when they found Laura. Slowly, she shifted her head, tail brushing faintly against the blanket. Laura crouched, Ash wriggling in her arms, and laid her free hand on Nora's shoulder. You too. You're mine now, and I'm yours. The moment held longer than signatures. The bond had always been written here, on a forest trail, in a sterile waiting room, in the nights when presence was the only medicine. Today simply made it official. Gravel crunched beneath her tires as Laura's truck rolled up the winding drive. Evening light spilled amber across the treetops, washing the cabin in hues of fire and honey. It stood as it always had, quiet, tucked among pines. But tonight it wasn't a place for solitude. Tonight, it was waiting. Ash squirmed in a nest of blankets on the passenger seat, nose fogging the glass, tail a blur. In the truck bed, Nora lay secured on a padded stretcher, eyes half-lidded, but aware. Laura parked and circled back. Easy, girl, she murmured, unfastening the straps. We're home now. Ash bounded into the yard, scattering leaves, chasing a moth, circling back to Nora in seconds. His nose nudged her gently, urging her forward. With effort, Laura guided her down. When her paws touched earth, Nora froze, then limped forward haltingly, breath audible but determined. Laura blinked against tears. That's it. One step at a time. Ash danced circles around her, tethering her to his joy. The yard came alive with crickets, rustling leaves, the distant coo of a dove. Once, Laura had heard them only as a backdrop to solitude. Tonight, they sounded like welcome. Nora's tail gave the faintest sway. Ash barked once, gleeful, circling her again. Laura stood at the porch's edge, arms crossed tight, as if to hold her heart together. The cabin had always been an island. But watching them move across the grass, she realized it had never been alive until now. She stepped down, crouched, one hand on Nora's shoulder, the other scratching behind Ash's ears. Welcome home, she whispered, her voice breaking. Nora leaned into her touch. Ash's tail wagged so hard, his body wobbled, and for the first time in years, Laura felt the cabin shift. Not in wood or stone, but in spirit. It wasn't a shelter for silence anymore. It was meant for laughter, healing, and family. As the last sunlight slipped into twilight, Laura guided them to the porch. Nora climbed slowly, Ash darting ahead and back, unwilling to cross without her. Laura opened the door wide. Warm light spilled across the floorboards. Nora limped inside, nose twitching at unfamiliar scents. Ash bounded in circles, barking once in delight before pressing back to her side. Laura closed the door, letting the silence settle. But it wasn't the old silence anymore. It was alive. Nora stretched onto the rug, Ash curling against her chest, already drifting to sleep. Laura stood over them, chest tight and easing at once. This was no longer survival. It was the beginning. And as she whispered into the soft room, "We're a family now," she knew it was true. No more empty nights. No more waiting alone. The morning sun spilled gently through the trees around Laura's cabin, painting the yard in gold and shadow. Pine scented the air. Insects hummed faintly. And for the first time since they'd arrived, the cabin no longer felt empty. It pulsed with life. Ash was everywhere at once. The little pup tore across the yard in frenzied discovery, skidding in the dust, chasing leaves, pressing his nose into damp grass until his whiskers twitched. He barked at squirrels, darted after shadows, toppled over in the grass, scrambled up again. His voice rang out, high, joyous, unbroken. Laura leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, laughter slipping free before she could stop it. The sound surprised her. Unguarded, real, not the brittle kind that sometimes escaped on patrol, but laughter born from joy. Beneath a cedar tree, Nora lay with her injured leg stretched carefully, her gaze never leaving her pup. Every dart, stumble and bark she tracked with sharp ears, rumbling a low warning when he strayed too far. She was still gaunt, still healing, but still his guardian. Laura's gaze softened. Ash was a reckless joy, Nora the steady anchor. One wild spirit, one watchful soul, she murmured. Ash barreled toward the porch, ears too big for his head, tail flailing wildly. He misjudged the step, slid back down, barked triumphantly anyway, then made it on the second try. He pressed his nose against Laura's boots before darting off again, unable to be still. "This place was too quiet," Laura whispered, crouching to brush the scuffs his paws had left. "I didn't even realize it until you filled it." Ash barked again, leaping at a butterfly and landing nose first in the grass. Laura laughed out loud, hand over her mouth, but unable to stop the sound. The forest, once heavy with silence, echoed it back like a song it had been waiting for. At last, Ash collapsed, sides heaving, and flopped against Nora's chest. She bent her muzzle over him, pressing gently into his fur. Ash sighed, surrendering to sleep. Laura crossed the yard and crouched beside them, resting her hand on Nora's side, brushing Ash's warm fur with the other. "This feels right," she whispered, "like it was always meant to be." Nora's eyes lifted, tired but knowing. Ash twitched in his dreams, and Laura felt the truth settle deep. This wasn't just her cabin anymore. It was theirs. By evening, the sky burned violet and rose, the yard alive with crickets and drifting wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Laura stood in the doorway, hand braced against the frame, watching the transformation unfold. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Nora stretched on the rug near the hearth, her chest rising steady, her head resting lightly on Laura's boot. Ash tumbled across the floorboards, pouncing on an old blanket, dragging it like prey, squeaking the toy a clinic nurse had given him. His bark cracked into something playful, his joy vibrating against the cabin walls. Laura stepped fully inside, closing the door. The hinges creaked, no longer a sound of loneliness, but of sanctuary. She sat on the couch, eyes never straying far. Nora's amber eyes flicked open briefly, then closed again with a sigh. Ash barreled onto Laura's lap, wriggling, then darted back to his mother. Back and forth, Laura murmured with a smile. Like you can't decide where you belong. But the truth was clear. He belonged to both of them. The fire crackled. Where once there had been silence, there was sound, paws against wood, Nora's sighs, Ash's squeaks. Where once emptiness, now movement. Where once was solitude, family. Ash flopped onto his back, paws batting the air. Laura reached down to scratch his belly, and he wriggled with delight before bounding back to Nora. She nuzzled him patiently, her eyes meeting Laura's in silent acknowledgement. Gratitude, trust, belonging. Laura blinked against tears. For years she had held herself tight, trained to stay composed. Tonight she let them come, soft and quiet, slipping down her cheeks. She bent forward, resting one hand on Nora's head, her other palm full of ash as he pressed against it. "You've changed everything," she whispered. "Both of you." For a long moment she stayed like that, hand on Nora, ash in her palm, her heart fuller than it had been in years. By nightfall, the forest hushed. The moon cast silver light across the floor where lamplight couldn't reach. The cabin air carried wood smoke and the earthy scent of damp fur. Laura lay on the rug near the hearth, jacket folded beneath her head. Her bed waited only steps away, but she refused to leave this moment. Ash curled in the crook of her arm, paws twitching in dreams, breaths warm against her chest. Each whimper he gave, she hushed softly, whispering until he stilled. Beside them, Nora stretched across the rug, bandaged leg awkwardly but steady. Even in drowsiness she shifted closer, her flank brushing Laura's side. The weight was faint but anchoring. For years, Laura had gone to bed alone. She had told herself the silence was peace. Tonight she knew it had always been empty. And tonight, for the first time, it wasn't. The forest outside whispered with owls and wind. Once, those sounds underscored her isolation. Tonight, they were guardians, wrapping the cabin in quiet protection. Ash yipped suddenly in his sleep. Nora stirred instantly, eyes opening, head lifting. She softened only when she saw him calm again, lowering her head but not moving away. She stayed close, as though keeping vigil over him, and over Laura too. Laura blinked against fresh tears. She hadn't realized how starved she'd been for this. Companionship without words, trust without question. A bond written in silence, in shared breath, in hearts beating close. She reached her hand to Nora's shoulder, feeling warmth through roughened fur. Nora sighed and pressed closer, relaxing deeper into the rug. Ash shifted in his dreams, snug against Laura's chest. Laura closed her eyes. The stove crackled. Ash breathed against her skin. Nora's chest rose steady against her palm. For the first time in years, she didn't brace against the night. She let it hold her. And in that quiet, she finally believed. She wasn't alone anymore. Morning sunlight spilled across the cabin floor in golden stripes. It should have been quiet, serene, the kind of calm Laura had grown used to in recent weeks. But calm never lasted long with Ash. The tiny German Shepherd pup darted across the room like a spark of fire. His target, a woolen sock draped on a chair. Ears pricked, tail wagging, he crouched, then pounced. Laura, still in pajamas, was refilling the water bowl when she noticed. "Ash," she warned gently, already knowing what would happen. Too late. He seized the sock and bolted through the doorway, weaving past Nora, who lifted her head lazily from her sunlit spot. The older dog flicked her tail, unimpressed but unbothered. Laura gave chase, laughter bubbling out before she could stop it. The first real laugh she'd allowed in months. "Ash!" "Drop it," she called, though she knew he wouldn't. The pup skidded to a stop, sock dangling like a trophy, barking in triumph. Laura's heart lifted at his mischief. He darted again, weaving between her legs, rolling on the rug, tossing the sock in the air with perfect timing. Laura stumbled, tears springing to her eyes, not of grief, but of joy. It was only a sock. Yet in that simple rebellion, the weight she had carried for so long began to ease. Weeks of silence and sorrow peeled away with every bark and scamper. His chaos was healing, proof that life could still be vibrant. Nora rose carefully from her sunbeam, moving with slow grace. She lowered her head near Ash, acknowledging his victory without challenge. Ash sat tall, chest puffed, tail wagging, a tentative bark, asking for approval. Laura crouched, ruffling his fur. "You little troublemaker." Ash barked, nuzzling her hand. For a moment, the three of them sat in sunlight together, warmth and laughter replacing the silence of weeks past. Ash wriggled away to dig in a blanket pile, and Laura scooped him up, shaking her head with delight. He wriggled free, more energetic than before. Each dash, each bark, reminded her of something she'd missed, the unrestrained joy of living. Nora shifted closer, leaning against Laura's leg, steady as always. Ash paused, gauging her calmness, then settled beside her with the sock still in his teeth. Laura gathered them close, sunlight catching Ash's golden fur and Nora's healing patches. Family, she realized, was not perfection. It was survival, loyalty, joy, and unspoken bonds. For the first time in months, she felt wholly present. Ash's heartbeat against her chest, Nora's pulse at her side, rhythms of life, chaos and beauty intertwined. Eventually, Ash dropped the sock and curled against Laura. Nora stretched back into her sunbeam. The cabin, once echoing with loneliness, was alive again. She leaned back, smiling quietly. Healing had come not in grand gestures, but in simple moments. A sock, a bark, a wagging tail. Night fell, the forest whispering outside. The cabin glowed softly from the fire. Laura sat wrapped in a blanket. Ash nestled against her chest, finally asleep. Her fingers stroked his fur, marveling at the fragile peace. Nora, though scarred, remained alert. A faint rustle outside made her stiffen, amber eyes glinting in the firelight. A low growl rumbled from her chest, warning and defiance. Laura noticed immediately. "Nora," she whispered. The growl wasn't for her, but for whatever moved in the shadows. Branches scraped the roof, leaves tumbled in the wind. Darkness seemed to breathe closer. Nora shifted into a protective stance, despite her limp, growl steady, every muscle braced. Laura's heart swelled. This dog had been broken by injury, yet her spirit was untamed. Laura knelt beside her. "You're amazing," she murmured. Nora flicked her gaze briefly in acknowledgement, then returned to her vigil. Ash twitched in sleep, a whimper escaping. Laura tightened her arms around him, but this moment belonged to Nora. Outside, the shadows hesitated, as if wary of the loyal guardian inside. With careful steps, Nora moved to the doorway, positioning herself between danger and family. Laura followed, whispering, "It's okay. We're safe." But she knew safety wasn't given. It was earned through vigilance and courage. Nora's eyes flicked back toward them, a silent promise. She would endure pain and weakness if it meant protecting them. She planted herself firmly by the door, every sense alive. The night stretched on, quiet but tense. Laura watched in awe as Nora remained motionless yet resolute. Ash stirred, then settled again, secure under Nora's protection. Laura felt the depth of their bond. Ash brought laughter, Nora, strength. Together, they balanced joy and vigilance, light and shadow. She understood fully now. This family depended on each other not just for comfort, but survival. At last, the shadows passed. Nora's growl faded, though her eyes stayed watchful. Laura brushed her side. "You're incredible," she whispered. Ash nuzzled her hand. Nora leaned into her touch. They were healing, loving, enduring, together. The forest calmed. The fire dimmed to embers. The night no longer felt threatening, but protective. True guardianship, Laura realized, wasn't the absence of fear, but the courage to act despite it. She whispered, "We'll face it all, together." Nora lowered her head in acknowledgement. Ash pressed closer. For the first time, the night felt safe. Later, Laura sat with tea cooling in her hands. Ash slept by her side. Nora rested by the window, one paw stretched out, eyes calm but alert. The day had been full of small triumphs, Ash's antics, Nora's cautious strength, their quiet companionship. And in those hours, Laura realized the truth. She had not just rescued them. They had rescued her. Her cabin, once a prison of solitude, now brimmed with warmth. Ash, once fragile, now mischievous and fearless, proved that joy could return after hardship. Nora, steadfast and scarred, taught her that strength meant endurance, not absence of pain. She remembered the clinic nights, Ash trembling in her lap, Nora enduring therapy. She had sat with their pain, powerless, yet learning to feel deeply again. She recalled their first night in the cabin, the walls embracing her instead of isolating her. Now she knew. They had given her back the capacity for connection. Simple acts of care, feeding, holding, protecting, became conduits of healing. In giving herself to them, she had allowed them to give themselves to her. Ash nudged her hand, tail wagging softly. Nora met her eyes with a gaze that pierced through walls. Laura saw it clearly. Rescue was never one way. Tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. These animals had broken through her armor with patience and authenticity. She whispered their names. Nora, Ash, a prayer, a vow. They lifted their heads, eyes glowing in firelight, acknowledging her voice. "You've saved me too," she breathed. The night deepened. The forest outside no longer felt like exile, but a world to share. She thought of the life ahead, laughter, healing, countless ordinary days, and felt peace. She had not just given them a home. They had given her back her heart. As the fire dwindled, Ash curled tighter against her, Nora steady by the window. Laura closed her eyes with a smile. Family, in its truest form, was here. Messy, fragile, joyful, enduring. And for the first time in years, she believed again in love, loyalty, and the healing power of life shared together. The first morning after the rescue felt surreal. Laura stepped onto the porch, autumn air wrapping her like a familiar cloak. Leaves drifted. The town hummed faintly below. But something lingered, an expectancy in the air. By mid-morning, visitors came. Mrs. Callahan, the baker, arrived with warm bread. "Thought you could use a little sweetness," she smiled. Ash bounded forward, tail wagging, while Nora watched calmly. Soon, more neighbors appeared with casseroles, blankets, and dog treats. What had begun as a solitary cabin now pulsed with connection, alive with kindness. Children hovered shyly, then joined Ash's orbit of play. Nora, steady and watchful, accepted gentle pats, embodying resilience. To the children, the two dogs weren't just survivors, they were living emblems of hope. Questions poured in about the nights of fear, the surgeries, the quiet courage that had carried them all through. Laura, careful to keep the focus on the dogs, felt their gratitude, but also their awe. The rescue had become more than her story. It was a collective reminder of endurance and compassion. Even the local news came, cameras capturing Ash's antics and Nora's quiet strength. Laura spoke simply, without flourish. The truth was enough. Fragile, extraordinary, and deeply human. By afternoon, gifts piled on the porch. Handmade beds, baskets of vegetables, a carved wooden plaque reading, "Nora Ash, Symbols of Resilience." Laura traced the letters, her throat tight. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement of silent courage. The yard rang with laughter as Ash chased children in loops. Nora lay serenely, grounding the energy with calm vigilance. Laura realized their survival mirrored the town's own spirit, fragile, enduring, transformed. Neighbors lingered, sharing their own struggles, their own resilience. The cabin became not just her refuge, but a sanctuary for all who gathered. For Laura, the revelation was clear. The story of survival had rippled outward, forging bonds that would last. At dusk, as laughter softened into goodbyes, Laura stood watching Ash chase the last leaves, while Nora padded quietly behind. For the first time in years, she whispered and believed, "We're not alone. We never were." Days later, Laura retraced the forest trail. The air was sharp with pine, the forest floor gold with fallen leaves. Each step carried memory. The first sight of Nora, trembling and broken, and Ash, crouched in fear but daring to take one trembling step toward trust. She paused at the spot, kneeling to touch the earth where Ash had once shivered, where Nora had lifted her head with cautious gratitude. Whispering their names, Ash, Nora, she honored the courage that had changed all their lives. The forest, silent yet alive, seemed to hold their story. Laura felt its lesson. Survival is not just strength, but choice. A pup's single step toward trust had set in motion healing, not only for him and his mother, but for her too. Looking up through shafts of sunlight, Laura understood. The forest had witnessed more than a rescue. It had seen transformation. Fear into trust, pain into resilience, solitude into connection. As she turned homeward, Laura carried it with her. The smallest act of bravery could ripple far beyond what one imagined. That night, the cabin glowed warm with a firelight. Laura sat on the floor with Ash curled in her lap, his small body vibrating with contentment. Nora lay nearby, eyes calm and intelligent, her quiet presence anchoring the room. For the first time in years, loneliness had lifted. The cabin that once echoed with silence now pulsed with life. Stroking Ash, Laura whispered, voice trembling, "You didn't just find me. You led me to the love I didn't know I was missing." Ash thumped his tail. Nora pressed her head to Laura's boot. Around them, photographs told the story. Nora's first steps, Ash's playful leaps, the trail where trust was born. Fear had become courage. Strangers had become family. Laura spoke again, her words meant for both dogs and the quiet night. "I've been so afraid, so alone. But you showed me love isn't something you search for. It finds you. She laughed softly, an understanding laugh. Ash nuzzled her cheek. Nora's gaze glimmered with serene strength. You taught me patience and bravery, Laura said to Ash. And you, she whispered to Nora, showed me resilience that doesn't roar. It waits. It rises when needed. The three sat in silence, breathing in rhythm with the forest beyond. It was a moment of healing, suspended in time. Laura's heart swelled. This connection, this family, was the truest kind of home. She kissed Ash's head, laid her hand on Nora's side. We're home, she whispered. We've made it. Together. The cabin walls no longer echoed with loneliness, but with love. Healing, she realized, was not earned alone. It was created together. Through trembling choices, quiet courage, playful mischief, and steadfast loyalty, they had built a bond unbreakable. Laura closed her eyes, letting the quiet embrace her. Ash's sigh, Nora's steady presence, the hum of the forest. It was enough. The world felt whole again. And she knew without doubt that this family, this home, was life's greatest miracle. Watching Nora and Ash's journey reminds us of the quiet, unwavering loyalty that dogs bring into our lives. German shepherds, with their intelligence and courage, show us what it means to love without hesitation, to trust without question, and to stand by us when the world feels uncertain. Their devotion teaches us something we often forget, that connection, patience, and empathy are gifts we give and receive every day. Laura's story is a gentle reminder that rescuing an animal can sometimes mean being rescued yourself, emotionally, spiritually, and in ways words can't fully capture. There's a richness in the human-animal bond, in the shared moments of vulnerability, play, and quiet companionship that transforms ordinary days into something meaningful. If you've ever wanted to deepen that bond with your own dog, I've found a resource that feels less like instruction and more like a conversation, something to explore when you have a quiet moment with your companion. It's helped me notice the little gestures, understand their feelings, and savor the trust they place in us. You might find it as comforting and inspiring as I have, because at the end of the day, love and loyalty are not just taught, they're shared.